All right, everyone, we will get started here. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Jenkins. I work at the Porter Branch Library, and today I would like to welcome for our Lunch and Learn our 2024 through 2026 Virginia Poet Laureate, Mattie Smith. Hi, Mattie.
Hello, nice to meet you all.
Yes.
Megan, thank you for inviting me to participate in your Lunch and Learn series today.
Oh, yeah, not a problem. We're so happy to have you, and we are here to talk about exploring poetry's connections today. So I'm really excited. And just to kind of start off with introductions, Mattie Quesenberry Smith, apologies, I forgot the first part, teaches first-year writing and rhetoric at Virginia Military Institute, where she integrates STEM topics into her writing and rhetoric courses and researches the impact of writing and integrates technology and engineering design-based teaching and learning. I hope I got that right.
Yes.
So you have quite the teaching. I will say that. I took rhetoric when I was in grad school earlier, and that was a tough class. But very important. So tough work. Education-wise, Ms. Smith holds a master's in creative writing from Hollins University and a bachelor's in biology and English literature and creative writing. Wow. And you recently defended your dissertation for a PhD in curriculum and instructions from Virginia Polytechnic University and State Institute. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Virginia Tech is a great place to go to college. In your older age, I attended that PhD program. Oftentimes I drove there, but I also had the opportunity to take online classes. So I focused in curriculum and instruction with respect to integrating a number of topics across disciplines. So my specific focus is critical reflective writing during technology and engineering design thinking. So Virginia Tech is a great place to look at that integrative approach to teaching and learning. I think it's modeled throughout the state of Virginia, quite actually, by a number of instructors who have graduated from that program and who are mentoring others in the public school systems.
Oh, wow. That's a lot. I mean, going for any PhD is a lot, let alone for something that's on teaching and curriculum. I'm like, ooh.
I'm interested in thinking about critical reflection. People often talk about critical thinking and reflection, but I divided up critical reflection into phases that are similar to what you'd see in writing studies, so in composition theory. And I enjoyed looking at technology and engineering design thinking through the lens of composition and rhetoric theory.
Wow.
That was quite helpful. Really enjoy the overlaps that I see too between science and technology and creative writing. So while I couldn't focus in my dissertation on every type of writing, I did have a section where I was able to explore a little bit the relationship of creative writing, such as poetry, during design thinking. So how could designers who are students who are learning through design-based teaching, how could they benefit from, say, writing about their design in a sci-fi scenario, or writing a poem about their design, to kind of get them to think linguistically, like how they're using their language about their designs differently for an audience that might not know as much about the design in technical ways, while still using key technical language. So
nonfiction writing can be very hard to write in a creative fashion, I feel, in some fields.
Right.
But I do think that having technical, that's very like left brain versus right brain in my brain, at least when you talk about that. But yeah, it's you can have narratives in nonfiction writing, and I think knowing how to cater that to specific audiences and for specific purposes is very important. Because human beings at heart, we're storytellers. So
I think when you look at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University in general, I think over the years you see more emphasis on the humanistic studies, um, creative writing, as much as rhetoric and composition. I think you see that those departments have grown over the years at Virginia Tech.
Hmm.
We think of Virginia Tech as Polytechnic Institute, right, and State University, but they're doing a great job allowing people to look at the overlaps in disciplines.
Well, that's so interesting. So, I guess my first question, just to kind of start us off, is what type of creative writing do you do? What, at least like maybe like in this point, or what have you done in the past?
Okay, so I enjoy writing poetry. I primarily write in free verse, though I do have, I guess, a strand of sound that I usually weave throughout the poem. You'll see some sounds that are repeated. When I was at Hollins in the 80s, I like to say that, like in the 80s,
In
well, in
the
the 80s at Hollins University, when I studied undergraduate English literature and then through the master's program in creative writing, particularly with poetry, they focused a lot on free verse. Free verse was kind of in then. So I skirt the formalist approaches, not so much because I don't agree that they should be there or I'm, somehow in rebellion against them. It was just the time when I came into creative writing coincided with the fad of, it's not really a fad, but with an emphasis on creative nonfiction, poetry, prose poetry, free verse. So that allowed writers to have a little more of a rein in narrative that didn't have to adhere to syllabics and feet.
Yeah, I feel like that was a movement. That was
Yeah,
a whole movement.
I think that it's nice if you know a little bit of everything about that, though. I think that
Mhm.
having a formalist awareness enhances a writer's ability to get that poem on the page. Um, I think we know that formalist poetry, if it's followed perfectly in lockstep, for some reason or another, is less engaging, which I think is an interesting phenomenon to think about. So, formalist poetry, I believe, benefits from an element of surprise when you break a tiny rule.
Mm, I
So,
agree.
but yeah, I write primarily free verse.
Okay, that's good. I would say I think when you talk about like formalist poetry can be hard to engage with readers. I think of like Ted Kooser and then Mary Oliver. They both wrote books, and Ted Kooser, I believe, was a poet laureate, if I'm not mistaken, like one of the U.S. poet laureates. And I think they both kind of touched on that, where trying to connect, I think, poetry written in like a specific style or language can be hard for like modern vernacular or understanding unless you've like really like dove into like how like a oh gosh, I can't even think of like a poetry style now that I'm put on the spot, but how like a specific style is written a certain way, essentially. So
Yeah, the lyrics, honestly, a lot of rap lyrics
mm,
are are really at the end of the day formalist. Is that fair to say?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think music, like people forget sometimes lyrics in songs are it's poetry essentially.
Right.
So, but yeah. Anywho, before I get like too far ahead of myself, poet laureate, you are our Virginia poet laureate. I'm gonna pull up here Governor Glenn Youngkin's announcement for you. This was back in November. Um, I guess I want to start by asking you, what do you see as a poet laureate? I guess because some people don't know what a poet laureate is, and I can read off some like, I guess, formal definitions from like the Academy of American Poets or Library of Congress. But I'd like to ask you, like, when you were given the title of Virginia Poet Laureate, I guess, what did that mean for you, I guess, or how do you see it?
Well, when Brooke Tribble called me on the phone and asked me if I'd be willing to serve the Commonwealth as Poet Laureate, the first thing I asked her was, what do I need to do? Before,
Yes.
agreeing to something like that, you really want to know, what do you need to do? And she said, well, Mattie, it's up to you.
That's
Which is
nice.
nice, because then, it seemed that for whatever reason, their team was confident that I would represent the state well as Poet Laureate and serve the Commonwealth. So I think you want to serve the state well and the people who live there. So I think honoring some of those interwoven connections between people across regions is important. To me, a poet laureate, since this is the state poet laureate, I feel like the poet laureate should have some awareness for the geography of the state, for the enterprises of the state, and for the heart of the people who live in the state. I would hope that in some way my poetry could reflect an aspect of that. Obviously, I'm not from the coastal area. I'm not from the Piedmont. In fact, I'm from Appalachia. So I imagine that I have the freedom to write through the perspective I gained as I grew up in the Appalachians in Virginia. But at the same time, I've lived in every corner of the state except for the southwest, tip of the state. So I've lived in Northern Virginia. I lived in Arlington County for a number of years. I left there in '94, moved to Virginia Beach, lived there until the early 2000s, and then moved to Lexington, Virginia. So I have experienced the coastal, the northern, and the western side of the state.
I see.
So I think
Wow.
having an awareness for the state. At the same time, I do believe, and I trust that Brooke Tribble was authentic, and I believe she was when she said, "Whatever you want to do." So I don't think there are many constraints on what the poet laureate should be able to do, but I do think the poet laureate should keep in mind the people.
Yeah.
So there should be added service. In other words, more extra personal energy than intrapersonal energy, call it, right? So my focus, it can't just be on me, but there needs to also be an awareness for different voices around the state and trying to uphold them, cultivate them, perpetuate them.
Yeah, I think when I was looking this up, the Academy of American Poets had mentioned about poets recognizing the place that poetry has in a state's cultural tradition and civic life. I think you basically said the same thing there, which I think, depending on, I guess, the poet, like how you go about doing that is really like the question. It's such like there's endless possibilities. But something that Governor Glenn Youngkin had mentioned that you had also touched on when I met with you previously was the announcement regarding his specific statement: for thousands of years, poets have taken the everyday joys and lamentations that humans experience and express them through verse and prose. So I kind of want to touch there is how that, I guess, connects people in a way. I'm going to kind of just
Well, first of
turn
all,
it.
isn't it beautiful that he includes verse and prose,
Yes.
right? Number one, but also that he allows for the spectrum that exists really in our emotions and experiences, from joys to lamentations. I like the
Mm-hmm.
fact that he included lamentations because sometimes people like to avoid those things that are less seemly. And it's, when people have negative emotions and, sadness, loss, fear, that the Governor Youngkin has given latitude to those expressions. So clearly, he's not gaslighting poets by any stretch of the imagination, right? So he's given a great, and I believe that he's drawing from the Psalms, for example. Just the idea of the psalmist writing psalms. They're quite varied in focus and in emotions. And sometimes you're like, are you on a roller coaster or what? Right? The psalmist goes through highs and lows. Fair. Um, he dwells in poetry about war and enemies, um, love,
Yeah.
power, insecurity, fear, death. So I do like that statement that he included in his press release. That I find I draw strength from that, and also energy, right? Or hope that we can really support our poets wherever they are in their expression.
Yeah, I think we forget poetry. I mean, well, not necessarily we. Sometimes we only like to look at the highlights of things. You see social media and you see a lot of like pictures and stuff of just showing highlight reels of one's life. Whereas poetry, specifically, I almost feel like with honestly any form of creative writing, you have this reflection of the human condition and you have reflections that are sometimes more lamentation or regret or loss, sadness, and these more like you don't want to advertise these emotions, but they can also just be observations of condition or injustices or just things that we see and we want to write about. So I think poets definitely help people connect with themselves and connect with each other. Funny enough, I think of the Super Bowl.
Right.
The songs and the lyrics that were chosen, how for a lot of people that connected a lot of people. So I think it's definitely a way to draw people together um, and then have
I
shared
think
experience.
too, people when they read a poem, um, they connect somehow on an emotional level, a heartfelt level that might not exist necessarily in prose and nonfiction. And I'm not saying that's purely true because obviously there are descriptive elements and narrative elements in storytelling that exist in, say, autobiography, nonfiction writing, etc. But it's a different type of appeal to people. Whereas in poetry, there's much more of an earnest effort to reveal an emotion and to leave an impression um, on the reader, and the reader shares that through the reader's sensibilities. And I think it's a beautiful thing, really, that a poet can communicate and share heartfelt experiences that others are drawn to because they also share those, or they don't, and they get a surprising insight.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all have emotions, we all feel. And poets have a very artistic way of expressing, whether it be using more literal phrasing or almost metaphorical phrasing. I think I'll have us transition to, I guess, poetry's sense of place, how sometimes using either the natural world or the things around us to have expression that helps connect people, I guess, together. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I have a lot of thoughts on that, given the fact that I have a biology major and an English major and a master's in creative writing. And then I also have looked at technology and engineering design-based thinking and project-based learning throughout K through 18, and really started to think about, what's going on here in these disciplines. The real world is something we all share, right? And if we think about it, the way we communicate about the real world is through our language, through metaphor, through analogy. So at the end of the day, a poet is basically a scientist, and a scientist is a poet. I mean, and you can see
Mm.
some examples of that in scientists and poets throughout the ages.
Yeah.
So both need to use language to describe new things. So you'll see a lot of words that have entered into our language are actually coming from science, technology, and engineering, math,
Yeah.
that also innovations. A lot of the words that are getting added into our dictionary are coming from that side of the house. We don't have many Shakespeares hanging out who are creating new metaphors and analogical expressions to the
Yeah.
degree that Shakespeare did. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think I mean, I really like what you said about throughout the ages, you've seen poets using the natural world, like objects from the world, to express something deeper. I think of
Yes.
a lot of stories in the Bible use natural world elements to convey a deeper meaning, for as an example. So absolutely, we have
We
a
get a lot of new words. Poets should be kind of happy because there are a lot of words that are being created in the scientific world, in engineering, certainly in software development. And these words, you know, that's a treasure box as far as poetic expression is concerned, for
mm,
sure. The real world for me is the natural world. That's where I dwell the most in my poetry. I do research my poems. I research scientifically what's going on behind that poem. I do write about what strikes me. Since I'm out in a rural area more, I grew up in a rural area, so I grew up hunting and fishing. I didn't hunt, by the way, but fishing and trapping.
yeah.
Um, and
You grew up in that
raising,
culture, though.
right, I am in that I grew up in that culture, yes. I spent a lot of time outdoors as a child in the mountains, as I said, on the river. And as a result of that, I draw a lot of my inspiration from the natural world and its beauty. Um, you can write about a painting, right? You can have ekphrastic poetry about a paintings, but you could also see nature the same way. So I do see nature the same way. And another thing about the natural world is that really things do strike you. I mean, you'll notice something. For example, you might notice a dragonfly on a rock. There's something about that that strikes me emotionally. And then I draw metaphors from the natural world like that. But, you know, if you were really studying me that day, you probably figure out what was going on in my poem a little better. It wasn't just about a dragonfly, right? Or it wasn't just about the brook trout. It was about my nostalgia. I write a lot about brook trout, and these are nostalgic poems. My heart goes out to that trout, the brook trout in the Appalachians, the remnant brook trout. I say remnant because they exist there. Um, from the time we had the ice age. So these brook trout are still in our smaller streams in the mountains, and then we're there fishing for them, but they're getting a little shorter every day. They're not, you know. I have a short story that I wrote. It has a lot of poetic elements in it, and I talk about how it was a big deal if we had maybe a 15-inch brook trout. That was a big deal. But these days, it's like a big deal if you catch a 9-inch native brook trout.
Oh,
So I focus a lot on brook trout. I
I
collect
see.
fossils. I'm
Well,
really interested in that.
yeah, you sound with using your like undergraduate, like your passion for biology can be a great way. I think of Mary Oliver a lot when I think of that, because I believe she wrote a lot about nature and the natural world as well. We do have a poem by you today. You brought us. Oh my gosh, let me get the title right. Consider the conifers, how some are firebred. Why don't you give us a little bit of? Actually, I'll have you read it first. And then
you want me to read it first and then discuss it?
Yeah. So
Like,
let me
okay, sure.
Stage here.
So we'll read it first and then discuss some of the real world elements, I'm guessing, is what you'd like for me to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me bring up the proper one.
All right. Okay. Oh, wow. Thank you. That's nice. Okay. I'm going to read it from my desk because I am a little nearsighted.
Sounds good. That's okay.
Okay. All right. Consider the conifers, how some are firebred. All right. This poem was in part inspired by a text, the Bible, Acts 2, verses 2 through 3. Okay, so I'm going to read that first. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat upon each of them. Acts 2, 2 through 3. Consider the conifers, how some are firebred. I am thinking of you, Chelsea, how you whispered to me that the wind left you unstirred. I am thinking of you because I just returned from the forest where I heard every fir tree whir, wind stirred. I was listening to the wind, surrounded by wind. I watched the wind circuit whispers through the firs, here, there, everywhere, the stir. Consider again, Chelsea, the conifers, how they cling to charred seed beds, spring from cold fire beds, fire bred. Consider that serotinal day when wind rushed a locomotive fire through your forest, burned a mosaic across the mountain, and flailed. Consider those pitch prime pines, the lodge poles with their cones fisted tight. They were fire's fierce delight, spat in sparks through the dark night. Consider again how the lodgepole breeds, each seed slipped on a wooden scale, protected by a single claw, stubborn, resin-sealed seed. But fire explodes the fist held tight, burns back claws, unhinges the door, and scatters seeds on its cinder path. Afterwards, surrounded by char, the seeds root and spring into an unseemly green. I stood there, Chelsea, heard the wind stir, watched it tip each needled whirl, knock, pine cone against stick. I heard it today, the snick of tight-fisted cone against bough. The winds were here, there, everywhere, the stir. Wind fans sparks in our own slow nights. We too are fire's fierce delight.
Ooh, I feel like I should snap for that. So what brought this poem about? Just to kind of, I guess, touch on it a little bit. It's a beautiful poem with a lot of natural world woven into it, I should say.
So a couple of things. First of all, a lot of my poetry deals with light, imagery about light, metaphors about light, etc. And this is an interesting part of the Bible that speaks about cloven tongues like as of fire descending on these people, right? So that's going on in the poem. This idea of what does that mean exactly, right? So then we have very literal fire, and we have fire that rushes through forests and actually creates a new nutrients, right, for new growth. So we have this terrible thing that kind of ransacks the forest. But
I think of the LA fires that have been.
Oh, yeah. Now this was published in the Holland's Critic years ago. This was written before the LA fire. I have a couple of forest fire poems that I have. I also have a poem about like catastrophes in general. I'm interested in catastrophe and catastrophic things because we see that as like chaotic, unmanageable, uncertain. But there's also a certainty about forest fires too. Like it's certainly not all destructive. Now, by the way, I worked for the Forest Service in the Youth Conservation Corps, and I was trained to fight forest fires. And I thought I was going to fight them one day myself, but I was young. I thought, oh yes, I'm going to go out west and fight forest fires. But I didn't get a chance to do that. But I did learn a lot about forest fires. This poem is also about a friend. And a friend who was, who didn't really necessarily share the same beliefs I have. So it's a poem to her that's speaking analogically about that as well.
Wow.
But literally the poem works. I like to have my poetry make sense in the physical world. I don't like for the poetry to break with what we really know in this time and place about the natural world necessarily. So I like to research the poems and make sure they do connect and to the best of my ability, because we don't know everything about the natural world. We're always a little uncertain somewhere, or we'd have no science. Why would we need scientists? So this poem is about a forest fire. I experienced forest fire here in Rockbridge County. We see a lot of smoke from forest fires that break out in the Shenandoah and also west of us in Allegheny County. So that was in the background of the poem. And forest fires in general are something that we're afraid of when we live in forests, right? Because the pine trees themselves they're like tinder boxes, especially dead pines. So I have a little bit of that going on in the poem. And I am intrigued in the middle of the poem about the mosaics that happen when forest fires cross the mountains. So some places will burn, others will be left. So it's kind of interesting, just the mosaics, like the patterns that exist in forest fires. Not everything's burned to the ground necessarily. So that's kind of interesting.
I think of those little hopes, I guess, left behind.
And then, of course, the lodgepoles. We don't have lodgepoles around here, by the way, but I kind of got a little bit poetic here because I conflated lodgepoles with all the pines in a way. Because, for me, when I look out my window, I see white pines, Virginia pines, cedars, and hemlocks. Right? So there was a little bit of conflation here, but I really seized upon the idea of how the lodgepole absolutely requires forest fire for germination.
Interesting. How a tragedy or something that's with uncertainty can bring out like a hope or bring out a certain resilience.
This is what my thought. That was the background scene of the poem. And I don't like to say things directly, so I try to use the analogies that I draw to the natural world, again, to the best of my ability. I'm not saying it's perfect, but definitely to communicate what I think are spiritual truths, let's say.
Absolutely. Sorry, my hair is like getting all over the place.
So the fire. At the end, I have a different fire in mind when I say we too are fire's fierce delight.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing, first of all. That is such a great way to incorporate the natural world and your background with biology into poetry that can convey an emotion or a more metaphorical reference. That's such a great thing. I guess we'll kind of finish up with thoughts on poetry, creating this sense of it sounds very cheesy to say phoenix rising out of the ashes type of moment, but joy or hope in the midst of experiencing a fire, so to speak, whether that be a tragedy, loss, or just seeing the world around you. I think there's all this negativity that can draw.
Yeah, we have plenty of negativity, that's for sure. But we do get to write about our lamentations. Don't forget the governor's words.
Yes, we
A
sure
lot of
do.
people like to dwell in that. I don't know why. It was interesting in my study that I did that the students also spent some time talking about their setbacks and uncertainties during design. But we need to begin to embrace uncertainty differently if we want to persevere in problem solving. Let's say
Mm,
that straight up. But anyway, beyond that, I guess as far as how this relates to okay, joy. I think I'll start with the word you said. So joy. Science, the scientific world, the natural world brings so many joys to us. I mean, just the excitement of realizing you have a problem that you don't quite know the answer to
mm,
can can for some people be a joyous moment. Now it's going to require endurance, right? It's going to require a bit of perseverance, perhaps. And you'll see scientists spend obviously decades on a certain question.
yeah.
I think scientists and poets enjoy the natural world similarly, like that.
Mm,
Maybe poetry is more about an individual, a poet, and their response to the natural world and their heartfelt responses, and how they actually use their emotions paired with experiences in the natural world newly in metaphors. But so do scientists. They do the same thing.
I agree. I
Right?
think poets and scientists bring forth either it's really observation and
Yes,
they
that's
bring it
right.
to people to connect people to some sort of conclusion that the poet or scientist wants you to have, or they leave it more open ended because oftentimes when you answer a question, it usually follows another question. So,
I
yeah,
like that
absolutely.
observation. Yeah, scientists and poets are both keenly observe. What's the word? They're keenly aware. Actually, for both, just all of the aspects of the real world, and then of course scientists get to talk about because they have so many cool tools, right?
Yeah.
They get to talk about the unseen world,
Mm. The
which
things
I
that
think
not
is
seen, perceived
fascinating.
to the naked eye, so to speak. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
So I've been exploring a little bit, for example, about light. Their
Mm.
tools allow them to investigate a broader range of the spectrum than we get to see. But
Wow.
the excitement for that and the questions, I think poets and scientists share the same questions.
Mm. Wow.
The death of the universe, the birth of the universe, death and birth, that would be one I would say they share. I
Interesting.
remember when I went to the Porches, which is a retreat in Norwood, Virginia, right after I found out I had the appointment and I accepted it to work on the 4 books. So I have 4 books collected. I need to I need to work on some lineation in those books. The line breaks, I'm not comfortable with all of them. But meanwhile, while I was there, I really started to think about the relationship between the scientist and the poet, and the connections between science and poetry. And my mother years ago found in an antique store, she found 3 volumes of Edgar Allan Poe's work. And I read
Mm.
Eureka. And by the way, I didn't quite understand everything he was saying in Eureka. Please do not think I did. But what is so fascinating about Eureka is that first and foremost, he was a poet and a creative writer. I would not call Edgar Allan Poe a 100% scientist per se.
Mm.
But what he says in Eureka is kind of fascinating because it actually precedes what we now know about the beginning of the universe with, quote, the Big Bang. So he kind of anticipated some of the theoretical revelations that occurred later.
Wow. That's
Yes,
so interesting. Wow.
yes.
Learn
So
something new every day.
poets dwell in the realm of intuition. but so do scientists, I would argue.
Well, that is certainly a note to kind of close us out here today. Both. Wow, that's a good one. Yep, observant and follow their intuitions. Yeah.
Yep, observe and follow intuition, and respond when something strikes you.
Mm.
That is, I'll wrap that back around to critical reflection. A person who's critically reflective is one who responds. First, they draw analogies to what they've experienced from the past, and then they think about, well, what am I going to do in the future from this? So a critically reflective person is looking ahead and being self-directed about what they're going to do with whatever they've noticed or learned or pulled together differently.
Wow.
So yeah, I think scientists and poets have the natural world at their fingertips and draw, scientists are they're obviously poets because they come up with new terms for things they're doing that we have to be able to understand.
The people, yep. I think having your words be understood by I say common people, but the everyday person who may not spend as much time in poetry is very important. So, well, I will leave it here today. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to explore poetry connections, whether it be with people, emotions, the natural world. And congratulations on your appointment. And I think we Virginians look forward to seeing what type of projects or impact that you make on having poetry kind of connect to the Commonwealth of Virginia. So,
well, Beckett, I'm just waiting to hear. You're the first person who contacted me.
Yeah. Well, yep. I'm so glad. Well, I will leave it here. Thank you all so much for joining, and we will see you guys in the next one.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You as well.
Bye-bye.